I decided that I would make part 1 and part 2. This is now part 2 of weaving yarn, what really works. In the beginning, I talked about how you could use. In the beginning, I mentioned that you could use some of your knitting and crocheting yarn for weaving. There's a couple of things you could do to prepare it. You could take a niddy noddy and take your skein or hank, whatever terminology you use, wind it on the niddy noddy and just let it sit for a day or two. Some people like to spritz a little bit. You're taking some of that stretch out and you're also strengthening a little bit. You could do that. It's also a way of measuring it if you don't have a measuring device. If you are a spinner, you could maybe take some of that yarn and spin it on some of your spools. Again, you're stretching it out a little bit, giving a little tension to it, and letting it sit a little bit. If you are someone who has a cone winder, you could do the same thing. You could take the yarn and wind it on the cone and prepare it that way. And again, just let it sit for a little bit, and that will also strengthen it. Now, I'm someone who doesn't always do all the things that I say, but I highly recommend it if you're starting. You don't want a little too much spring in the yarn and then it doesn't come out the way that you think it's going to come out. Sometimes I have happy accidents and sometimes not, but I highly recommend kind of preparing some of that yarn if you're not ready yet to invest your money into more yarn on cones. I am someone who has not done art yarn spinning, but once in a while I do spin some yarn that's very thick. So I'm going to use this as an example, and you can imagine that some of this might have feathers in it and other locks and things like that for people who do art yarn. But it's very thick. This one's the mix of the Angora. This one's just some wool that mixed with wool. This one has a little bit of sparkle in it and some other fibers that were mixed in. All hand spun. I happen to mostly use a floor loom, but I'm going to talk about rigid heddle in a moment. Now, this particular reed is part of a reed, and this one happens to be 6 dents per inch. I also have one that's 4. So if you had 4, it might be even better for some of the art yarn. Now, one of the suggestions is not to use all of your art yarn in the whole project. You might want to accent a little bit. So what you could do is you could put maybe 1 art yarn and then maybe some other yarn, maybe 2 in each one of the dents for a few inches, and then another art yarn back and forth. Someone I saw did a very lovely woven piece with doing something like that. It was very, very nice. So that's one thing you can do using a thicker reed. Something else that people can do is supplemental. So supplemental is another something you can take a look at. It basically is where you're weaving, but we'll pretend this is the art yarn. It kind of floats over the top and you use one of your shafts to lock it in every once in a while. Again, there's a whole book and a whole lot of things out there on supplemental warp, and I'm not going to take the time to explain that now. But one of the questions I have gotten from people is, what am I going to do? I have this kind of heddle, or these kind of heddles in my loom. That art yarn's certainly not going to fit through that. What am I going to do? Well, you can first of all go through your house and see what you have that could represent the center part or the eye of your reed. I came across some things that we had, some washers, a little key ring. I even have this, and then there's also little O-rings. They come in a bag. I don't know if you can see them or not, but they're all little rubber O-rings. Probably get them at the hardware store. I also have a hair tie, a small hair tie. What I did was I took one of the O-rings and created a heddle using some string. What I did was I took one of the heddles that I have on my loom, one of my looms, and basically I measured it. So you can see the center. You could use any one of these if you really want to have some very thick, any of these, and you can create your own heddle. So the middle piece here, your art yarn should be able to go through very nicely to weave with. Again, O-rings, little rubber O-rings come in handy for all kinds of things, like fixing your faucet perhaps, but in this case you can use some for your weaving. Maybe you say, no, wait a minute, I have a rigid heddle loom. How can I do the same thing? Well, you could, if you have a rigid heddle that's a 4-dent reed, you could use that. However, if you really are getting into using your thick yarn, your art yarn for weaving, this is one that's made by Kromsky, and it would probably fit other looms as well. It's a variable dent. You get different bags. This one happens to be 12 dents, little plastic. They're all separate, and you can arrange them in any way you want. And turn to the side here. So in this case, I decided, I think these are 10. I did 10 dents, and then I did the 4, and then I did a couple of 10. So I spread out the art yarn idea, spaced it out, and you can take this apart. You can arrange it all different ways. It goes, I think I have, let's see, we have all different dents. We have 5 dents, and we have 12 dent, 10 dent, and 8. So I used 8 and the 5 in this particular situation. So that's another idea. If you decide, hey, I have a rigid heddle loom, I'm gonna get one of these, and they do come in different widths. This one I believe is a 20-inch width. All right, I'm going to zero in on each one of these items, and I'll explain what they are. Different ways of measuring yarn if you've lost the tag. And again, in weaving, it's a little different what you consider. And first of all, I know in knitting you use the wraps per inch, and I'm going to demonstrate that or talk about that one. And then there's also a little McMorran yarn balance. I'll explain that. And then we'll look at charts or other charts that you can look at to decide how to warp your loom or how many ends per inch. So what I did, the yarn and the cone, I took a ruler and I did some wraps and I wrapped it around. It came out to about 15 wraps. Now if we look over at the little booklet and zero in, it gives us some suggestions. We're zeroed in as much as we can. For a balanced weave, plain weave, it says to do your wraps and divide by 2. Now in weaving, we like to use even numbers, especially for the warp. So if it came out to be 15, I would go up to 16 and divide that in half, and then I would set it at 8 ends per inch. If I want it to be warp face, that means all the yarn on the top to be shown, then it's telling me to double it. So that 15 would be 30. If I want it weft faced, it's said to then divide it by 3, which is not something a lot of weavers use. But many people like to have a balanced 2-2 twill, and then you would take 2/3 of your wrap. And if, in this case, the 15 would be nice to go down to 10. Those are just some suggestions for determining the amount of yarn or how many ends per inch that you need for weaving. So here's our McMorran yarn balance. There's directions on the internet and other places for it, but I thought it might be fun for you to see how it works. What you do is a little balance going on, and I have some wool that maybe I don't know how many yards per pound it is, and I need to know because I want to make something. So what you do is you cut a piece of yarn, and then you slowly, it doesn't have to be even, you slowly nip off a little bit of yarn until the little arm starts to go up and is balanced. Still not moving yet. See, it's still almost there. Still not quite. All right, a little bit, another nip. All right, that's pretty good. And then what you do is you would take your yarn and you would take this piece and measure it. Okay, I took the yarn off and I'm measuring it. It's a little bit more than 8 inches, maybe 8.5 or 8.5. So what I would do is I would multiply that times 100, and then I would know that this yarn is about 850 yards per pound. I'm going to end this presentation with some other information that might be helpful to you. Some things that I have been using over the past, and there are charts. I know we like to just kind of wing it, and I do that sometimes, and you can do that often after you've learned something. It's like cooking something and not reading a recipe anymore. We used to have to read the recipe so everything came out the right way. But when you start, it's a good idea to have something to look at to help you out. The first thing that I like to use is a chart that helps me to determine how many ends per inch. Now, I happen to have a little book here that has some information in it. This is an out-of-print book by Handwoven called Weaver's Companion. But there are charts on the internet that are free, and I'm sure if you do a search looking for something called Sets for Common Yarn Types, you'll find something useful for you. They'll have something for cotton, for wool, for linen, all kinds of fiber. I'm going to use an example here and just read this to you. Let's say I have yarn and it's 3/2 cotton, or maybe I don't know what it is, but I do know it's about 1,200 yards per pound. Well, they're telling me for 3/2 cotton, it's suggested for a plain, that would be tabby weave, no pattern, 10 to 12 ends per inch. But if I want to do a twill or something maybe with a pattern in it, it's suggesting 15 ends per inch. That's very useful information. However, maybe I only have one reed. I don't have maybe a 10 or a 12 or a 15 dent reed. Maybe I have an 8 dent reed, or in this case, we're going to use a 6 dent reed. So how am I going to use this? Well, this chart is a reed table. It's something else you can find. And the reed table will give you the different size reeds at the top, and it'll also tell you the order. So for example, perhaps I'm going to use this and I'm not going to use every single dent or every single slot. Or maybe I'm going to put 2 in every one. So for example, if this is a 6 dent reed and I want to set something, what did it say? 12 ends per inch? I can just put 2 threads in every slot. Sometimes though, maybe it's 2 and then 1 and then 2 and then 1 and then 2. There's different ways you can do your own calculating if you'd like to, or you can find one of these handy dandy charts. And this is again another out of print little booklet. This one's called Handbook of Time-Saving Tables. Again, find them out there. They're in books, they're in magazines, whatever you need. They're a nice reference. I do hope some of this information has been helpful to you. If you have more questions, please feel free to message me or send me an email.